Number 1. The Christchurch mosque shootings. On the morning of March 15th, 2019, the city of Christchurch, New Zealand, was thrust into the global spotlight for one of the darkest days in its history, a day where peace and sanctuary were shattered by an act of calculated, white supremacist terrorism that would leave 51 people dead and 40 others physically injured, with the emotional shockwaves reverberating across the entire nation and the world. The perpetrator of this atrocity was Brenton Harrison Tarrant, an Australian national who had meticulously planned his attack for nearly 2 years, driven by a radicalized ideology rooted in xenophobia and white supremacy. Tarrant was not born into extremism. He grew up in Grafton, New South Wales, in a working-class family, and after his father died of cancer when Brenton was young, he inherited a modest sum of money and dropped out of personal training college. He began traveling extensively, visiting countries in Europe and Asia, but it was a trip to Eastern Europe, particularly the Balkans, that appeared to solidify his hateful worldview. He eventually settled in New Zealand, viewing the country as a strategic location due to its remote location and relatively lax gun laws at the time, moving to Dunedin where he lived a quiet, solitary life that masked his growing obsession with acquiring firearms and planning mass murder. He legally acquired the weapons used in the attacks, including 2 semi-automatic rifles and a shotgun, exploiting loopholes in the licensing system that allowed him to modify these weapons to increase their lethality, effectively turning them into military-style assault rifles. His preparation was obsessive and detailed. He practiced shooting at local ranges in rural areas near Dunedin, casing potential targets and planning his logistics with the precision of a military operation. He selected his targets the Al-Noor Mosque and the Linwood Islamic Center, not because of any personal grievance against the specific worshippers there, but because they represented the Muslim community, a group he scapegoated for his perceived societal grievances and the demographic changes he feared. Tarrant began the day of the attack by driving from Dunedin to Christchurch, a journey of several hours, during which he listened to music associated with radical nationalism and psyching himself up for the violence to come. He parked his vehicle near the Al-Noor Mosque in the suburb of Rickcarton just before 1:40 p.m. He was dressed in tactical clothing, body armor, and a helmet, and he had attached GoPro cameras to his headgear with the explicit intention of live-streaming the massacre to social media, a grim and unprecedented tactic designed to propagate terror and inspire like-minded individuals globally. He entered the mosque grounds and immediately began shooting indiscriminately at worshippers who were gathering for Friday prayers. Inside the mosque, the scene quickly turned into a nightmare. As the call to prayer echoed, the sound of rapid gunfire erupted. Tarrant moved through the hallways and prayer rooms, reloading multiple times, targeting men, women, and children alike. He spent approximately 10 minutes inside the mosque, firing hundreds of rounds. Survivors described the chaos and terror, with people diving under pews, scrambling for exits, and in many cases, playing dead in hopes of surviving the onslaught. The audio from his own live stream captured the sheer brutality of the event, including the sounds of gunfire and his own hateful rhetoric as he executed people at point-blank range. He left Al-Noor Mosque after running out of ammunition in one of his magazines, returning briefly to his car to retrieve other weapons before driving across the city to the Linwood Islamic Center, which he had identified as a secondary target. The police response to the shootings was chaotic, but ultimately decisive. The first emergency calls came in at 1:41 p.m., reporting shots fired at Al-Noor Mosque. Within minutes, police units were dispatched, but the scale of the attack was initially unclear. As Tarrant was leaving Al-Noor, a brave bystander, Abdulaziz, who was worshiping at Linwood, realized what was happening when the attacker arrived there. As Tarrant entered the Linwood Islamic Center, Aziz grabbed a simple F-pose machine from the counter and threw it at the gunman, attempting to distract and disarm him. When Tarrant retreated to his car to get another weapon, Aziz chased him with a discarded shotgun, keeping him at bay and preventing him from re-entering the mosque to continue the slaughter. Aziz's heroic actions undoubtedly saved lives at Linwood, where the death toll was significantly lower than at Al-Noor. Meanwhile, Tarrant's vehicle was spotted by police as he fled Linwood. Officers pursued him, ramming his car off the road near the suburb of Sydenham. Police officers smashed the windows of his car, dragged him out onto the road, and arrested him, finding explosive devices in his vehicle, though they were later determined to be rudimentary. It was approximately 1:52 p.m., just over 10 minutes after the first shots were fired, that Tarrant was in custody. The immediate aftermath saw hospitals across Christchurch overwhelmed with casualties, and a lockdown was imposed on the city as authorities worked to ensure there were no other accomplices or active shooters, although Tarrant acted alone. The investigation into the shootings was swift and exhaustive, led by the New Zealand police and supported by international agencies. Tarrant was charged with 50 counts of murder and 39 counts of attempted murder, charges that would later be updated as one of the victims died in the hospital weeks later, bringing the murder count to 51. He was held in solitary confinement in a maximum security prison in Auckland, where his movements were heavily restricted due to concerns for his safety and the risk of him using his incarceration to spread propaganda. While he initially indicated he might represent himself and use the trial as a platform to spout his extremist views, he ultimately changed his plea to guilty in June 2020. This was a strategic move by the prosecution and a relief for the victims' families, as it meant they would not have to endure the trauma of reliving the events during a lengthy trial or be subjected to Tarrant's testimony. His guilty plea to all charges was accepted, and the matter proceeded directly to sentencing, a phase of the legal process that became a focus of the nation's grief and the victims' voices. The sentencing hearing, which took place in August 2020, was a monumental event, not just for New Zealand but for the world, as it saw the imposition of the first whole-life sentence in the country's history. Judge Cameron Mander presided over the hearing, listening to days of victim impact statements from survivors and the families of those who had been killed. These statements were heart-wrenching, describing profound loss, the trauma, and the devastating impact on the Muslim community. The courtroom heard from parents who had lost children, children who had lost parents, and individuals who had survived but were forever scarred by the violence they witnessed. Tarrant sat largely impassive throughout the proceedings, often watching a remote feed from his prison cell, rather than being physically present in the courtroom, which became a point of contention for many who felt he should face the consequences of his actions directly. On August 27, 2020, Justice Mander handed down the sentence, ordering Tarrant to serve life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This was a historic legal milestone in New Zealand, as previous life sentences usually included the possibility of parole after a set minimum period, typically ranging from 10 to 30 years depending on the severity of the crime. Judge Mander stated that Tarrant's crimes were so depraved and wicked that the community's interest demanded he never be released. Beyond the legal proceedings, the Christchurch mosque shootings had profound and lasting impact on New Zealand society, politics, and legislation. The Prime Minister at the time, Jacinda Ardern, became a global figure of compassion and resolve in the wake of the tragedy, famously donning a black headscarf when visiting the grieving Muslim community and delivering a powerful message that they are us, emphasizing that the victims were an integral part of the New Zealand whānau or family. Her government moved rapidly to introduce stricter gun control laws. Just 1 month after the attack, the Parliament passed legislation banning most semi-automatic firearms, large-capacity magazines, and parts that could convert weapons into military-style ones. A gun buyback scheme was subsequently established, which saw thousands of firearms handed into authorities. This swift political action was a direct response to the public outcry and a determination to ensure such an attack could not be so easily repeated. Furthermore, the shootings prompted a national conversation about racism, extremism, and the role of social media in radicalizing individuals. The Royal Commission of Inquiry into the terrorist attack was established to examine the circumstances leading up to it, including whether state agencies could have prevented it. Their subsequent report, released in late 2020, was critical of intelligence agencies, stating that while Tarrant was not on a watch list for active plotting, there were intelligence failures and insufficient focus on right-wing extremism as a growing threat. The Christchurch terror attack also exposed the darker underbelly of the internet and the challenges of regulating online content. Tarrant's live stream of the massacre was viewed tens of thousands of times before it was taken down, and copies of the video circulated on various platforms for days afterward. This led to a major crackdown by social media companies and discussions between governments and tech giants about how to prevent the live streaming of mass violence. The Christchurch Call, a commitment by governments and tech companies to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content online, was initiated by New Zealand and France in May 2019 as a direct result of the attack. The tragedy forced the world to confront the reality that modern terrorism relies not just on weapons, but on the amplification provided by digital platforms. In the years since the attack, the city of Christchurch has undergone a long process of healing and rebuilding. The sites of the attacks became places of pilgrimage and mourning. Al-Noor Mosque was renovated and reopened with enhanced security features. But for the survivors and the families of the victims, the physical rebuilding does not erase the trauma. The community has shown immense resilience, working to foster understanding and unity in the face of hatred. The first anniversary of the attack saw nationwide commemorations, with moments of silence held across the country to honor the victims. The perpetrator's name has largely been scrubbed from public discourse in New Zealand, an effort to deny him the notoriety he sought, referring to him simply as the terrorist. However, the trial and the sentencing ensured that his actions were recorded and condemned in the strongest possible terms by the justice system. The 51 victims, whose names are now inscribed on a memorial in Christchurch Botanic Gardens, are remembered for the lives they lived and the diverse tapestry they contributed to New Zealand society. The tragedy fundamentally changed the country's sense of safety and identity, shattering the illusion that such extreme violence could not occur on its shores, but also galvanized a movement for kindness, inclusivity, and a refusal to let hate win. The Christchurch mosque shootings remain a stark chapter in New Zealand history, a reminder of the devastation caused by extremism, but also a testament to the resilience of a community and the power of compassion in the face of evil. Number 2, the Grace Millane murder. The story of Grace Millane is one that struck a chord with travelers and families around the world, highlighting the potential dangers of modern dating and the vulnerability of young women exploring the world alone. Grace was a vibrant, intelligent, and adventurous 21-year-old woman from Wickford in Essex, England, who had embarked on a dream gap year, traveling through South America and New Zealand. She had graduated from university with a degree in advertising and marketing, and was described by her family as kind, funny, and always a person who would look after others. By late November 2018, Grace had arrived in New Zealand, a country renowned for its safe and welcoming reputation, and was documenting her journey for her family back home, who were in constant contact with her. On November 30th, 2018, the eve of her 22nd birthday, Grace was in Auckland, staying at a backpacker's hostel in the city center. She was active on the dating app Tinder, looking to meet people and experience the local nightlife. It was here that she matched with a 26-year-old man whose name is Jesse Kempson, a figure who would soon become synonymous with one of New Zealand's most notorious criminal trials. They arranged to meet for a drink on the evening of December 1st, a Friday. That day, Grace exchanged messages with her family, telling them she was excited for a date and that she might be out late celebrating her birthday the next day. She put on a silver necklace with a butterfly pendant, a gift from her parents, and left her hostel, full of hope for the evening ahead. She and Kempson met at 6:15 p.m. at the Sky City Complex, a hub of activity in downtown Auckland. Over the next few hours, the couple visited several bars, including the Bluestone Room and the Public. They were seen on CCTV footage walking through the city, appearing comfortable and conversing. Witnesses later described Grace as being happy and seemingly enjoying herself, drinking cocktails and laughing. There was no indication from her demeanor or her text messages to friends that she felt unsafe or uncomfortable with Kempson. By approximately 9:41 p.m., the couple entered the City Life Hotel on Queen Street, where Kempson was staying in room 319. It was the last time Grace Millane was seen alive, and the events that transpired inside the hotel room became the subject of intense scrutiny and a protracted legal battle. Inside the hotel room, the details of what happened are pieced together from the defendant's statements, forensic evidence, and digital footprints, creating a picture that was as disturbing as it was tragic. Kempson claimed that their intimacy turned consensually rough, suggesting that Grace had asked him to choke her during sex, a claim that would become the centerpiece of his defense. However, the prosecution painted a starkly different picture, arguing that Kempson, a man with a history of deceit and violence against women, had killed Grace in a fit of rage or during a sexual assault that went too far. The Crown's case alleged that Grace died from sustained pressure to her neck, likely strangulation, which lasted for a significant amount of time. Sometime between 10 p.m. and midnight on December 1st, Grace was killed. After her death, Kempson did not call emergency services, nor did he panic. Instead, his behavior following the killing displayed a chilling level of calculation and indifference. He spent the next day, Saturday, December 2nd, which was Grace's 22nd birthday, engaging in a concerted effort to cover up his crime. At around 5 a.m., less than 6 hours after she likely died, he began a series of Google searches on his phone that betrayed his intent to conceal the body. The searches included queries about hottest fire, largest bird in New Zealand, are there vultures in New Zealand, and the Napier Ranges. These searches suggested he was considering methods to dispose of her body that would prevent its discovery, either by burning it or letting nature take its course. Later that morning, Kempson left the hotel to go to a Countdown supermarket, where he bought a large red suitcase and a cleaning cloth. Returning to the hotel, he was captured on CCTV wheeling the suitcase into his room. It was later theorized that Grace's body was placed inside the suitcase. The effort required to do so was evident from the damage found on the carpet and the wall of the hotel room, which was subsequently cleaned by Kempson. He also borrowed a shovel from the hotel reception. Later in the day, Kempson rented a Toyota Corolla car from a rental agency. He then went back to the hotel and, in a disturbing sequence of events captured on security cameras, was seen struggling to pull the heavy suitcase down the hallway and into the lift, the weight of it making the task difficult. He loaded the suitcase into the rental car and drove towards the Napier Ranges, a dense, bush-covered area to the west of Auckland. While en route, he stopped at a hardware store in Henderson to purchase a new shovel, indicating the previous one was perhaps not suitable for the task at hand. He then drove down a narrow gravel road known as Scenic Drive, parking the car in an area off the road. A local resident recalled seeing a man matching Kempson's description digging in the bush with a shovel that afternoon. This was the spot where Grace Millane's body was buried. He placed a suitcase containing her body in a shallow grave and covered it with soil and foliage. Perhaps the most damning aspect of Kempson's behavior was his return to normalcy immediately after disposing of Grace's body. That same evening, after returning the rental car, he went back to the City Life Hotel, cleaned himself up, and then joined a group of people he had met earlier in his travels for a pub crawl around Auckland's nightlife district. He appeared jovial and relaxed, showing no signs of the trauma or distress one might expect someone to feel just hours after accidentally killing a partner. The next day, December 3rd, he went on another date with a different woman he had met on Tinder. During this date, he was reported to check his phone frequently and seemed agitated when news of Grace's disappearance began to surface in the media. Meanwhile, Grace's family back in the UK had not heard from her on her birthday, which was uncharacteristic. They raised the alarm, and as the hours turned into days, the concern grew. The New Zealand police launched a missing persons investigation, releasing CCTV images of Grace and Kempson from their night out, appealing for information. The images showed the couple walking happily, a heartbreaking contrast to the grim reality of what had happened. Kempson eventually came forward to police, but not to help find her. When interviewed by detectives, he told a convoluted lie, claiming that Grace had left the hotel room alone around 9 p.m. on the night they met, saying she needed to buy a new charger. He maintained that he had not seen her since and that she had left behind her necklace and phone, a story that police quickly found holes in. The breakthrough in the case came through meticulous detective work involving digital forensics and physical surveillance. Police tracked the rental car Kempson had hired, finding evidence of soil in the boot consistent with the Napier Ranges. Analysis of his phone data placed him in the Scenic Drive area at the exact times residents had reported seeing a man digging. On December 8th, just a week after Grace was last seen, police launched a major search operation in the bushland off Scenic Drive. It was a heart-wrenching scene as officers, many of whom were parents themselves, scoured the rugged terrain. By the afternoon, they found the red suitcase buried in a shallow grave. They opened it to discover the body of Grace Millane. The discovery was a devastating blow to her family, who had flown to New Zealand to assist in the search, clinging to a sliver of hope that she would be found alive. Jesse Kempson was arrested and charged with murder on the same day the body was found. The news shocked New Zealand and the world. The image of a young woman murdered while on a trip of a lifetime resonated deeply, sparking fears about the safety of solo travel and the anonymity of dating apps. The trial of Jesse Kempson began in November 2019 at the Auckland High Court, presided over by Justice Simon Moore. The trial was intensely followed by the media, both in New Zealand and internationally, though strict suppression orders were initially in place regarding Kempson's name and previous criminal history to ensure a fair trial. The prosecution, led by Brian Dickey, presented a compelling case based on a timeline of Kempson's movements, the digital evidence of the Google searches, the purchase of the suitcase, and forensic evidence from a hotel room. They argued that Grace's death was not a sex game gone wrong, but the result of a violent act by a man who had a history of assaulting women. During the trial, the court heard that Kempson had been accused of raping and assaulting other women in the years leading up to meeting Grace. In one instance, he had attacked a girlfriend in a hotel room in a strikingly similar manner to the way Grace died. 4 women testified against him, painting a picture of a manipulative and violent individual who used charm to lure women before becoming aggressive. This evidence was deemed admissible to show a pattern of behavior and propensity for violence. The defense, led by Ian Brookie, did not deny that Kempson had caused Grace's death, but argued that it was accidental. They relied on the rough sex defense, suggesting that Grace had died consensually during a sexual encounter that involved choking. They played police interview footage in which Kempson cried and claimed he panicked when she died. However, this narrative was thoroughly dismantled by the prosecution and challenged by the evidence. The pathologist, Dr. Simon Stables, testified that Grace died from compressive neck injury and that the bruising on her neck was consistent with a sustained grip rather than consensual choking. Furthermore, the prosecution highlighted the absurdity of the idea that someone would panic and then behave as Kempson did, burying the body, cleaning the room, and going on dates. If the death was truly an accident, they pointed out that his extensive efforts to hide her body demonstrated consciousness of guilt. The jury also saw the CCTV footage of Kempson moving the suitcase, which the prosecution argued showed the cold attachment of a man covering up a murder, not the panic of a grieving man. The jury was retired to consider their verdict on November 22, 2019. After more than 11 hours of deliberation, they returned with a unanimous verdict of guilty. The sentencing phase of the trial brought further closure for the Millane family, though nothing could bring Grace back. Grace's father, David Millane, delivered a powerful and gut-wrenching victim impact statement to the court, speaking directly to his daughter. He described the pain of celebrating her 22nd birthday without her, the silence in their home, and the horror of knowing how she spent her final moments. He said that their family had been given a life sentence of grief without the possibility of parole. Her mother, Jillian, also spoke of the torture of not knowing what Grace experienced in her final hours and the devastating loss of her future. Justice Simon Moore, in sentencing Jesse Kempson to life imprisonment with a minimum non-parole period of 17 years, the maximum sentence available for a single murder in New Zealand at the time, acknowledged the brutality of the crime and the dehumanizing way Grace was treated after her death. He noted that Kempson had shown no remorse and had attempted to profit from his crimes, having reportedly sold an interview to a media outlet before his arrest. The judge described the case as a tragedy that had shattered a loving family and shocked the community. The aftermath of the Grace Millane case saw a significant impact on New Zealand society and legal discourse. It sparked a global conversation about the safety of women, the dangers of the rough sex defense, and the responsibilities of dating apps. Following the trial, there was a public outcry regarding the defense team's suggestion that Grace's sexual preferences were blamed for her death, with many arguing that this line of questioning further victimized her. The case highlighted the issue of violence against women and the prevalence of coercive control in relationships. The New Zealand government eventually moved to restrict the use of the rough sex defense in court, arguing that it should not be used to excuse murder or manslaughter. Additionally, the case prompted discussions about the suppression of the perpetrator's name. While his name was initially suppressed, it was eventually lifted due to a conviction on other charges, allowing the media to identify him. The media coverage of the trial, particularly in the UK, was immense, and the public in Britain and New Zealand rallied around the Millane family. Memorials were held in Auckland and Essex, and a mural of Grace was painted in a London tube station to honor her memory. Her death served as a grim warning to young travelers, but also united people in grief and solidarity. For the Millane family, the verdict and the lengthy sentence provided a measure of justice, allowing them to finally return home, knowing that the man who took their daughter away would spend a long time behind bars. The legacy of Grace Millane is not just as a victim, but as a catalyst for change, prompting societies to look more closely at how they protect women and how the legal system handles cases of intimate partner violence. Her story remains a harrowing reminder of the fragility of life and the predators that can hide behind a veneer of normalcy. Number 3, Lauren Dickason. The case of Lauren Dickason is one of the most harrowing and tragic domestic homicides in New Zealand's recent history, a case that sent shockwaves through the community of Timaru and ignited a national conversation about maternal mental health, postpartum psychosis, and the immense pressures placed on families during the COVID-19 pandemic. Lauren Dickason, a 39-year-old general practitioner originally from South Africa, moved to New Zealand with her husband Graham and their 3 young daughters, 6-year-old Leanne, 2-year-old Maya, and 8-month-old Carla, in late August 2021. They had high hopes for a fresh start, seeking a safer and better life away from the escalating crime rates in their home country, Pretoria. The family arrived in New Zealand just days before the country entered a strict COVID-19 lockdown, effectively isolating them in a strange new land. They settled into a rental property in Timaru, a quiet town on the South Island's east coast, while Graham began his new job as an orthopedic surgeon at Timaru Hospital. From the outside, the Dickasons appear to be a perfect family, with professional parents and 3 beautiful children. But behind closed doors, Lauren was battling a severe and deteriorating mental health crisis. She had a long history of depression and anxiety, which had been exacerbated by previous IVF treatments and the difficulties of motherhood. In the months leading up to their move, her mental state had declined significantly. She was known to be deeply devoted to her children, often prioritizing their needs above her own to a degree that alarmed friends and family back in South Africa. However, upon arriving in New Zealand, the support structures she had back home were gone. She was alone in a new country, in a lockdown, with 3 young children who required constant care, while her husband worked long hours. The isolation, coupled with the exhaustion of parenting and a possible resurgence of postpartum depression and psychosis, created a catastrophic environment that would culminate in a devastating tragedy just weeks after their arrival. On the evening of September 16, 2021, just over 2 weeks after the family had touched down in New Zealand, the nightmare unfolded. Graham Dickason had been invited to a work dinner with colleagues to welcome him to the hospital. It was meant to be a night of socialization for him, but for Lauren, it was another evening of solo parenting in a foreign house with 3 unsettled children. According to evidence presented later in court, the children were particularly difficult that night, with all 3 having tantrums. For a mother on the brink, this chaotic noise was likely the catalyst that broke her fragile psyche. Sometime between 6 p.m. and 7:30 p.m., while her husband was out, Lauren Dickason killed all 3 of her daughters. The acts of violence were unspeakable, involving the asphyxiation of the children. She used her hands to smother and strangle them. And in the case of the youngest, Carla, she also used a cable tie or similar ligature. After ending the lives of Leanne, Maya, and Carla, Lauren turned to violence on herself. She tried to commit suicide by cutting her neck and wrists with a knife and attempting to strangle herself with a dressing gown cord. She did not succeed in ending her own life, leaving her alone in the silent house with her daughters' bodies. When Graham returned home around 9 p.m., he discovered the horrific scene. The front door was unlocked, and the house was eerily quiet. He found his wife with self-inflicted wounds and, upon further investigation, found the bodies of their 3 daughters in their bedrooms. The emergency services were called immediately, but it was too late. The children were pronounced dead at the scene. Lauren was arrested and transported to Christchurch Hospital for treatment of her self-inflicted injuries before being moved into police custody. The investigation that followed was meticulous and deeply painful for the tight-knit community of Timaru. The police treated the scene as a triple homicide, and Lauren Dickason was formally charged with 3 counts of murder. The initial interviews with Lauren were complex. She appeared vacant, flat in her affect, and detached from the reality of the situation. In a video-recorded police interview played at her trial, she described the children as naughty and demanding that night, claiming they were fighting and that she had to stop them. She stated that she had decided to kill the children and herself because she felt she was a bad mother and believed they would be better off in heaven. The prosecution and the defense both agreed on the facts of what happened, that Lauren killed the children, but the legal battle that ensued was centered entirely on the question of her mental state at the time of the act. The central legal issue was whether Lauren Dickason was criminally responsible for her actions. Did she have the intent to kill the children, or was she so consumed by mental illness that she did not understand the wrongfulness of her actions? Her defense team argued that she suffered from severe major depressive disorder and parental postpartum complicity, and that she was legally insane at the time of the killings. They painted a picture of a woman who was mentally broken, isolated, and suffering from a severe depressive episode that evolved into psychosis, rendering her unable to form the necessary mens rea, or guilty mind. The legal proceedings were lengthy and emotionally charged, drawing significant attention from both New Zealand and international media. Lauren Dickason pleaded not guilty to the 3 counts of murder by reason of insanity. Her first trial began in the High Court at Christchurch in August 2023. The Crown prosecution, led by Deidre Orchard, argued that while Lauren was undoubtedly depressed, she was not legally insane. They contended that her actions were deliberate, calculated, and driven by anger and revenge against her husband, Graham. The prosecution highlighted evidence that suggested a motive of anger, pointing to the fact that she had killed the children while Graham was out, effectively framing him for the tragedy by leaving him to find them. They also introduced evidence that she had researched how to kill children prior to their move to New Zealand, suggesting premeditation. The Crown argued that she knew exactly what she was doing and that it was morally wrong, as evidenced by her attempts to hide the bodies and her own subsequent suicide attempt. They called upon forensic psychiatrists who testified that Lauren's depression, while severe, did not equate to a loss of reality. These experts argued that she was able to plan the killings and carry them out methodically, which indicated a level of cognitive function incompatible with an insanity defense. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman who felt overwhelmed and trapped in a life she no longer wanted, choosing the ultimate, devastating escape route. The defense, on the other hand, presented a compelling and heartbreaking case regarding the state of Lauren's mind. They relied heavily on the testimony of 3 psychiatrists who had interviewed Lauren extensively and reviewed her medical history. These experts argued that Lauren was suffering from a unique and severe form of postpartum depression that manifested as a catatonic trance or a psychotic episode. They suggested that she had detached from reality, believing that she was actually saving her children from a life of misery and that they were going to a better place. The defense highlighted the extreme isolation she faced in a new country during a pandemic, the lack of sleep, and the suffocating demands of motherhood. They argued that her mental illness was so profound that she lacked the capacity to appreciate the nature of her actions, that killing her children was not a moral act of salvation, but an act of murder. The defense's narrative was one of tragedy rather than malice, that this was a medical failure as much as it was a criminal act, and that Lauren was a victim of her own mind. Throughout the trial, Graham Dickason supported his wife, sitting in the courtroom day after day, a testament to the complex nature of their relationship and the belief of some family members that the system had failed her. After weeks of complex medical testimony and disturbing evidence, the jury in the first trial retired to deliberate in August 2023. However, after more than 20 hours of deliberation, they were unable to reach a unanimous verdict. The 4-person advised the court that the jury was deadlocked, and Justice Cameron Mander discharged them, ordering a retrial. This was a blow to all involved, prolonging the agony for the families and the community, and requiring a second exhaustive examination of the tragedy. A new trial was scheduled for mid-2024. As the second trial approached, the legal landscape shifted. In July 2024, just before the retrial was set to commence, Lauren Dickason changed her plea to guilty. This dramatic change meant that the question of her sanity would not be put to a second jury. She accepted responsibility for the murders, effectively conceding the Crown's case that she was legally insane in the manner defined by the law, but pleading guilty to the act itself. This admission brought a certain degree of closure, bypassing the need for another grueling trial that would dissect the children's final moments and her mental state in such a public forum. The sentencing hearing for Lauren Dickason took place in Christchurch in August 2024. It was a somber and emotional occasion, filled with victim impact statements from the extended family. The most poignant statement came from Graham Dickason, the man who had lost his entire family in one night. In a powerful display of forgiveness and profound grief, Graham stated that he did not hold his wife responsible for the deaths of their children, attributing the tragedy to her severe illness. He expressed his love for Lauren and asked the court to show mercy, acknowledging that she was already serving a life sentence of guilt and loss. He spoke of the beautiful memories of their daughters and the vibrant future they could have had, which was cut short. The court also heard from Lauren's family in South Africa, who described her as a devoted mother who had been consumed by an illness that went unrecognized and untreated. While the Crown acknowledged the tragedy, they maintained that a sentence was required to reflect the gravity of taking 3 innocent lives, the most vulnerable members of society. Justice Mander had the difficult task of weighing the culpability of a mentally ill woman against the sanctity of human life. On August 30th, 2024, Justice Cameron Mander sentenced Lauren Dickason to life imprisonment with a minimum non-parole period of 18 years. This sentence was the maximum available for a single murder in New Zealand at the time, applied here with cumulative considerations for the triple killing. In his sentencing remarks, Justice Mander acknowledged the severity of her depression, but concluded that the mitigating factors did not outweigh the need for accountability. He stated that while she was suffering from a depressive disorder, she still possessed capacity to know what she was doing was wrong, particularly in light of her attempts to conceal the crimes and her subsequent suicide attempt, which he argued indicated a sense of guilt. The sentence, while intended to denounce the act, sparked debate among mental health advocates and legal experts. Some felt that the length of the sentence failed to take adequate account of her severe mental illness, treating her as a criminal rather than a patient in need of care. Others, however, felt that the sentence was necessary to uphold the value of the children's lives and to recognize the horror of the violence inflicted upon them. The case of Lauren Dickason remains a shadow over New Zealand's social fabric. It highlighted the desperate need for better mental health support for new mothers, particularly those who are isolated from their support networks. It exposed the sometimes inadequate systems for identifying and treating severe postpartum depression and psychosis, especially in times of crisis like a global pandemic. The tragedy prompted soul-searching among health professionals about how a doctor, someone who should have been able to recognize the signs of mental collapse in herself, could have fallen so far through the cracks. For the community of Timaru, it was a stark reminder that behind the closed doors of any home, a crisis could be brewing. The memory of Leanne, Maya, and Carla is preserved in the heartbreak of a nation that mourned their senseless loss, while the story of Lauren Dickason serves as a grim cautionary tale about the fragility of the human mind and the devastating consequences when that fragility is left unchecked. It forces society to grapple with the uncomfortable duality of Lauren Dickason as both a perpetrator of unfathomable violence and a victim of her own biology and circumstances, a woman who lost her way in a fog of depression and destroyed the very thing she loved most in the world. Number 4, the RSA murders. The RSA murder stand is one of the most notorious and senseless acts of violence in New Zealand's criminal history, a tragedy that highlighted catastrophic failures in the country's parole and justice system and left a permanent scar on the community of Napier. At the center of this nightmare is William "Willie" Bell, a man whose history of violent crime should have kept him behind bars, but instead was released back into society with deadly consequences. William Bell was born in 1978 and had a childhood characterized by instability and abuse. He grew up in the foster care system, bouncing between homes, and by his teenage years, he was already deeply entrenched in a life of crime. His offending escalated rapidly from petty theft to violent assaults. In 1996, at the age of 18, Bell committed an aggravated robbery that was a chilling precursor to the RSA murders. Along with accomplices, he broke into the home of a Chinese couple in Auckland, violently assaulting them and robbing them. During this attack, Bell kicked a woman who was 5 months pregnant in the stomach, an act of brutality that shocked even the seasoned police officers involved. For this crime, he was sentenced to 12 years in prison. However, the justice system's handling of his sentence and subsequent parole application would prove to be a fatal mistake. Despite his violent history and poor behavior in prison, which included drug use and assaults on guards, Bell was released on parole in November 2001, after serving just over 5 years. The parole board decision was heavily criticized later, as it appeared they placed undue weight on a psychological assessment that suggested Bell could be managed in the community, largely ignoring the very real risk he posed to public safety. Just weeks after his release, Bell, now 23 years old and free to walk the streets of Napier, began planning his next crime. The target of Bell's rage and greed was the RSA, Return Services Association, club on Meany Road in Napier. The RSA was a social club for war veterans and their families, a place where elderly residents gathered to play pool, drink, and socialize in a safe and friendly environment. It was a symbol of camaraderie and respect, but to William Bell, it was simply a soft target with a safe full of cash. On the evening of December 8, 2001, Bell entered the club, but he did not act alone. He was armed with a sawed-off shotgun and was accompanied by accomplices who acted as lookouts or drove a getaway vehicle, though Bell was the one who pulled the trigger. The atmosphere inside the club that night was relaxed and convivial. Among the patrons were Bill Absolom, a 68-year-old Vietnam War veteran, Wayne Johnson, a 58-year-old member, and Mary Loveday, a 56-year-old club employee and grandmother. Bell approached the bar area, his face hidden, and demanded money from the staff. He herded several members and staff into a back office, where he terrorized them at gunpoint. Mary Loveday, the club's assistant manager, was complying with his demands, opening the safe for him. But something in Bell's mind snapped, or perhaps the lack of respect for human life that he had always carried simply manifested itself. Instead of just taking the money and leaving, Bell began to shoot. He shot Mary Loveday in the chest at point-blank range as she stood by the safe. She died almost instantly. He then turned the shotgun on Bill Absolom, shooting him multiple times. Bill was a beloved member of the community, a former soldier who had survived the Vietnam War only to be gunned down in his local club. He suffered horrific injuries, but was still clinging to life when police arrived. Wayne Johnson was also shot, sustaining fatal wounds. The brutality was absolute. Bell did not hesitate to kill people who were offering no resistance, people who were elderly and vulnerable. He also shot and seriously wounded Helen Dixon, a club employee, leaving her for dead amidst the carnage. After the shooting, Bell fled the scene with a relatively small amount of cash, escaping in a stolen car. The police response was immediate, but the damage was done. When officers arrived at the RSA, they were confronted by a scene of absolute horror. Blood covered the floor of the office and bar area. The victims were rushed to Hawke's Bay Hospital, where Mary Loveday and Wayne Johnson were pronounced dead. Bill Absolom was rushed into emergency surgery, but succumbed to his injuries a short time later. 3 innocent people were dead, executed by a man who should have been in prison. The investigation moved swiftly. Bell was a known offender, and witnesses' descriptions and CCTV footage from the area helped piece together his movements. He was arrested a short time later, hiding out in a house in Napier. When police apprehended him, he showed little remorse. During his time in custody awaiting trial, Bell's behavior was erratic and aggressive. He reportedly sang the theme song from Sesame Street. During a police interview, a display of callousness that further outraged the public. He was charged with 3 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder, and aggravated robbery. The trial of William Bell began in November 2002 at the High Court in Wellington, presided over by Justice Wild. The prosecution's case was robust, relying on eyewitness testimony, forensic evidence, and Bell's own confession. The Crown painted a picture of a ruthless, cold-blooded killer who had been released from prison despite clear warning signs of his dangerous nature. The trial focused not only on the events of December 8, but also on the systemic failures that allowed him to be free. The court heard details about Bell's violent past, including the assault on a pregnant woman, painting a portrait of a man who was a ticking time bomb. The defense did not dispute that Bell had shot the victims, but argued around the intent and the specifics of the charges, though the strategy did little to sway the jury given the overwhelming evidence of his brutality. The jury deliberated for a short time before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. The public relief was palpable, but the sense of injustice regarding his parole remained a burning issue. The sentencing phase of the RSA murders case was monumental. Justice Wild had the task of imposing a sentence that reflected the severity of the crimes and the need to protect the community from William Bell forever. On February 19, 2003, Bell was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum non-parole period of 33 years. At the time, this was the longest minimum non-parole period ever imposed in New Zealand history. Justice Wild stated that the murders were of a cold-blooded and ruthless nature, committed against defenseless and vulnerable people. The 33-year minimum was specifically calculated to ensure Bell would never be released back into society while he was still capable of causing harm. It sent a strong message to the parole system and the judiciary about the gravity of recidivist violent offending. For the families of Mary Loveday, Wayne Johnson, and Bill Absolom, the sentence provided a measure of certainty that the man who tore their lives apart would die in prison. However, the case was far from over in terms of its impact on the New Zealand justice system. The RSA murders triggered a massive public outcry and a crisis of confidence in the parole board. Questions were raised about how a man with Bell's history could be deemed suitable for release. The government ordered a formal inquiry into the decisions made regarding Bell's parole. The subsequent report found that the parole board had indeed made errors in judgment, relying too heavily on reports that minimized Bell's risk of reoffending. The report highlighted that information about Bell's behavior in prison, including assaults on guards and drug use, had not been given sufficient weight. The tragedy forced a complete overhaul of the parole system in New Zealand. New legislation was introduced to ensure that public safety was a paramount consideration in any parole decision. The parole board's criteria were tightened, and the system became much more cautious regarding the release of violent offenders. The Bell Report, as it became known, became a foundational document in New Zealand criminal justice, changing how offenders were assessed and monitored. The aftermath of the victims' families was one of immeasurable grief and loss. Mary Loveday was remembered as a kind and hardworking woman who loved her job at the RSA. Wayne Johnson was a father and a popular figure in the community. Bill Absolom was a decorated veteran and a dedicated member of the RSA. Their deaths left a void in the Napier community that took years to heal. The RSA club itself became a place of mourning. The management and members were forced to grapple with the trauma of the event, and for a time, the future of the club was uncertain. However, the community rallied around the RSA, determined that it would not be defined by the violence that had occurred there. Memorials were held, and a plaque was installed to honor the memory of the 3 victims. The club eventually reopened its doors, though the security measures were significantly upgraded, a sad necessity in a post-RSA murder New Zealand. William Bell remains incarcerated to this day, having exhausted his appeals against the severity of his sentence. His name has become synonymous with the dangers of premature parole and the failure of the system to protect the innocent. In the years since his incarceration, there have been occasional reports of his behavior in prison, including an incident in 2017 where he was charged with assault on a fellow inmate, proving that he remains a violent and dangerous individual even behind bars. The 33-year minimum term means he will not be eligible for release until he is in his 60s, effectively ensuring he spends the rest of a productive life in prison. The RSA murders serve as a grim reminder that the justice system is not infallible and that the decisions made by those in power can have life or death consequences. It is a case study in the importance of risk assessment, the need for robust rehabilitation programs for violent offenders, and the necessity of prioritizing public safety above all else when dealing with high-risk individuals. The legacy of Bill Absolom, Mary Loveday, and Wayne Johnson lives on in the legislative changes that bear the scars of their tragic fate, ensuring that their deaths were not entirely in vain, but resulted in a safer society for future New Zealanders. Number 5. The murder of Sophie Elliott. The murder of Sophie Elliott stands as one of the most horrific and consequential crimes in New Zealand's legal history, a case that exposed the terrifying reality of intimate partner violence and the deadly depths of narcissistic rage. It was a crime that not only devastated a loving family, but also forced a nation to confront the antiquated legal defense of provocation, ultimately leading to a fundamental change in the country's justice system. Sophie Elliott was a 22-year-old woman with everything to live for. She was beautiful, intelligent, and kind, a gifted violinist who had recently graduated from the University of Otago with a first-class honors degree in law and a Bachelor of Arts in Politics. She had a bright future ahead of her, having already secured a prestigious job at the Treasury in Wellington, which was set to begin just a few weeks after her tragic death. She was vivacious and loved by her family and friends, living in a comfortable home in the suburb of Andersons Bay, Dunedin. with her father, Gil, and her mother, Leslie. However, lurking in the background of this promising young life was Clayton Robert Weatherston, a man who would become her murderer. Weatherston was a 45-year-old university lecturer, specifically an economics tutor at the University of Otago. He had been in a relationship with Sophie, a relationship that was short-lived, lasting only a matter of months, but which was characterized by a power imbalance and a growing sense of unease for Sophie. Weatherston was her tutor, a dynamic that gave him a position of authority which he exploited. As the relationship progressed, his controlling nature began to surface. He was possessive, jealous, and manipulative, traits that became increasingly suffocating for Sophie. By January 2008, Sophie had realized the toxicity of the relationship and had decided to end it. She was preparing to move to Wellington to start her new career, a move that symbolized her desire to move on with her life. For Weatherston, however, the breakup was not just to end a relationship. It was a narcissistic injury that he could not tolerate. The prospect of losing control over a woman he viewed as an extension of himself drove him into a state of escalating rage and obsession. On January 9th, 2008, a sweltering summer day in Dunedin, the violence reached its inevitable and bloody climax. Sophie was at home, busy packing for her impending move to Wellington and a holiday to Europe with her mother. It was meant to be a time of excitement and transition. Around lunchtime, Clayton Weatherston arrived at the Elliott family home. While the exact trigger for the initial argument remains unknown to anyone but the killer, the sequence of events that followed was of unparalleled brutality. Weatherston and Sophie went into her bedroom to talk, likely to finalize the terms of their separation or retrieve belongings. Within moments, the conversation turned into a violent altercation. Weatherston, who had armed himself with a folding knife from his car and was wearing a rubber glove on his left hand, launched a frenzied attack on the young woman. He stabbed her repeatedly, with a level of violence that went far beyond what was necessary to kill her. The autopsy would later reveal that Sophie had suffered 216 separate stab wounds to her body, including defensive wounds to her hands as she tried to fend him off. She was also strangled. The savagery of the attack indicated a state of uncontrolled fury. He slashed at her face, neck, and torso, mutilating her body in a display of sheer hatred. During the attack, Sophie's mother, Leslie, was in the house. Hearing the commotion and raised voices from the bedroom, she went to investigate. She opened the door to find her daughter lying on the floor, bloodied and motionless, and Weatherston standing over her. In a moment of sheer terror and maternal instinct, Leslie tried to intervene, but Weatherston pushed her away and slashed at her hand with a knife, injuring her. He then locked himself in the bedroom with Sophie's body for several minutes, leaving Leslie to scream for help in the hallway. When he eventually emerged, he was calm and composed, holding the bloodied knife. He walked past the distraught mother and fled the house, leaving a scene of devastation in his wake. The police response was immediate. Emergency calls were made at 12:51 p.m., and officers arrived at the house shortly thereafter. Despite being severely injured, Leslie Elliott was able to provide a description of the attacker and the events. Sophie was rushed to Dunedin Hospital, but her injuries were too severe. She was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The community of Dunedin was left in a state of shock. The murder of a young, bright student in her own home was a chilling violation of safety. A manhunt was launched for Clayton Weatherston, who had fled the scene in his car. However, he did not remain a fugitive for long. Realizing the inevitability of his capture, Weatherston drove to the Dunedin Central Police Station around 1:15 p.m. He walked into the station and calmly surrendered to the officers at the front desk, his hands covered in blood. He was immediately arrested and charged with murder. The speed of his surrender and his demeanor suggested a calculated man who had enacted a plan and was now ready to face the consequences on his own twisted terms. The investigation that followed pieced together the grim details of the premeditation. Weatherston had brought the knife with him to the house, hidden in his pocket, and was wearing the rubber glove, suggesting he had anticipated violence and wanted to minimize forensic evidence or injury to himself. A search of his car and computer revealed a deep obsession with Sophie and a history of controlling behavior. It became clear that the killing was not a spontaneous act of passion in the heat of the moment, but a calculated execution driven by a desire to possess or destroy the woman who had dared to reject him. The case sent shockwaves through the University of Otago community and the wider academic world, as details emerge about Weatherston's position as a lecturer and the power dynamic inherent in his relationship with a student. The tragedy also united the country in sympathy for Leslie and Gil Elliott, who had lost their only child in such horrific circumstances. Leslie Elliott became a prominent figure in the media, her dignity and grief resonating with the public. The trial of Clayton Weatherston began in June 2009 at the High Court in Christchurch, presided over by Justice Judith Potter. It was a trial that captured national attention, not only for the gruesome nature of the crime, but for the legal strategy employed by the defense. Weatherston pleaded not guilty to murder, instead admitting to the manslaughter of Sophie Elliott on the grounds of provocation. This legal move was controversial and deeply hurtful to the Elliott family. The defense of provocation, which was then part of New Zealand law, argued that the actions of the victim were sufficient to cause a reasonable person to lose self-control and commit a violent act. Weatherston's legal team, led by Judith Ablett-Kerr, argued that Sophie had provoked him by demeaning him, humiliating him, and belittling his sexual performance and his career prospects. They painted a picture of Sophie as a castrating, manipulative woman who drove a stable man to the brink. To support this, Weatherston took the stand for several days, where he displayed a chilling lack of remorse and a pervasive narcissism. He sat calmly, often with a smirk on his face, detailing his grievances against Sophie. He portrayed himself as a victim, claiming she called him a sociopath and a loser, and that he had lost control because of these insults. He claimed the violence was an explosion of rage caused by her taunts. His testimony was a bizarre mixture of academic arrogance and self-pity, as he analyzed his own behavior using economic theories and psychological concepts, seemingly detached from the horror of the reality that he had stabbed a young woman 216 times. The prosecution, led by Robin Bates, dismantled the provocation defense with surgical precision. They argued that the sheer number of wounds and the duration of the attack were inconsistent with a sudden loss of control. Instead, they pointed to the evidence of premeditation, the knife, the glove, the timing of the attack. They highlighted the overkill nature of the murder, suggesting that Weatherston had intended to annihilate Sophie, not just kill her. The prosecution also worked tirelessly to restore Sophie's character, countering the defense's attempts to blame the victim. They called witnesses who testified to Sophie's kindness, her gentle nature, and her excitement about the future, painting a stark contrast to the vixen persona the defense was trying to construct. The jury also heard from forensic experts who detailed the horrific nature of Sophie's injuries, emphasizing the sheer violence inflicted upon her. The evidence of the defensive wounds on her hands served as a silent testament to her final moments, fighting for her life against a man she had once trusted. The prosecution argued that Weatherston was not a reasonable person losing control, but a manipulative, controlling killer who took Sophie's life because she was leaving him, and he could not bear it. After a 3-week trial and more than 11 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. They rejected the defense of provocation entirely, finding Clayton Weatherston guilty of murder. The verdict was met with audible relief in the courtroom and applause from the public gallery. The finding was a vindication for the Elliott family, who had sat through weeks of their daughter being vilified in court. The sentencing phase was a powerful conclusion to the legal proceedings. In September 2009, Justice Judith Potter sentenced Weatherston to life imprisonment with a minimum non-parole period of 18 years. In her sentencing remarks, Justice Potter stated that the brutality of the attack was unparalleled, and that Weatherston had shown no genuine remorse. She noted that he had engaged in a calculated and sustained attack, and that his conduct in court, including his arrogance and lack of empathy, only served to confirm his dangerous personality. She remarked that the defense of provocation was inconsistent with the evidence, reinforcing the jury's decision. The 18-year minimum non-parole period was one of the longest ever imposed in New Zealand at the time, reflecting the severity of the crime. The legacy of the Sophie Elliott case extends far beyond the imprisonment of Clayton Weatherston. The trial and the use of the provocation defense sparked a nationwide debate about the appropriateness of the law in the modern era. The public was outraged that a murderer could blame his victim for his own violent actions. Leslie Elliott became a tireless campaigner for law reform, founding the Sophie Elliott Foundation to educate young people about the signs of abusive relationships and to advocate for changes in the justice system. She worked alongside other victims' advocates to pressure the government to repeal the partial defense of provocation. Her efforts, fueled by the heartbreaking experience of listening to her daughter being trashed in court, were successful. In 2010, just 2 years after Sophie's murder, the New Zealand Parliament passed the Crimes, Provocation Repeal, Amendment Act, abolishing the provocation offense. This significant legislative change meant that in future cases, killers could no longer claim that their victims' behavior was an excuse for murder. It was a direct result of the public outcry generated by the Weatherston trial and a lasting tribute to Sophie Elliott. The case also highlighted the issue of domestic violence and the red flags of controlling behavior in relationships, prompting discussions about how universities and institutions handle relationships between staff and students. For the Elliott family, the legal victory and the law change could never bring Sophie back, but they provided a sense of purpose and a legacy of protection for others. Leslie Elliott's advocacy turned a personal tragedy into a public good, saving countless others from potential violence. The home in Andersons Bay where the murder took place remained a grisly crime scene for some time before eventually being sold, a process that was painful for the community. Clayton Weatherston remained in prison, serving his sentence in isolation from a world that had recoiled in horror at his actions. He never expressed genuine remorse for the killing, maintaining his narrative of victimhood until the end. The murder of Sophie Elliott is remembered not just for the brutality of the act, but for the strength and grace shown by her family in the face of unimaginable darkness. It serves as a stark reminder of the lethality of narcissistic rage and the importance of recognizing the signs of coercive control before they escalate into fatal violence. Sophie's light was extinguished too soon, but her name lives on in the laws that were changed in her memory and in the awareness raised about the silent epidemic of intimate partner violence. Number 6. The Scott Watson case. The disappearance and murder of Ben Smart and Olivia Hope on New Year's Eve 1998 is one of New Zealand's most enduring and controversial criminal cases, a mystery that transformed from a frantic search for two missing friends into a high-profile murder trial that continues to polarize the nation to this day. The story begins in the idyllic setting of the Marlborough Sounds at the top of the South Island, a popular holiday destination known for its deep inlets, lush bush, and secluded bays. Among the thousands of revelers flocking to the Sounds to ring in 1999 were 21-year-old Ben Smart, a law student from Wellington, and his 17-year-old friend Olivia Hope, a photographer from Taranaki. They were young, attractive, and full of life, celebrating the end of the year at Fernal Lodge, a historic guest house and gathering spot for boat eyes in the Endeavour Inlet. The night of December 31st, 1998, was warm and festive. Ben and Olivia socialized with other holidaymakers, enjoying the live band and the festive atmosphere. However, as the night wore on, the logistics of getting back to their respective boats became an issue. Ben was staying on a boat called Tyria, and Olivia with friends on Diver. In the early hours of the morning, around 3 a.m. on January 1st, 1999, they were seen leaving the lodge party. They were last seen boarding a small water taxi, driven by a local man named Guy Wallace, to ferry them across the dark water to their vessels. This was the last confirmed sighting of the pair alive. Guy Wallace later testified that he had dropped the two off at a mysterious two-masted yacht, often referred to in the trial as the Mystery Ketch, which was anchored nearby. When Ben and Olivia did not appear the next day, their families initially thought they might have slept on another friend's boat or were simply sleeping in after the party. But as the day passed and no contact was made, worries set in. When the Tyria departed the Sounds on January 2nd without Ben on board, the alarm was raised. What followed was one of the largest search and rescue operations in New Zealand's history. Police, volunteers, and the Navy scoured the Marlborough Sounds, searching every inlet, cove, and beach. They used helicopters, divers, and boats to look for any sign of the missing pair or the mystery ketch that witnesses described. The description of the boat was specific: a two-masted ketch, roughly 40 feet long, with a fiberglass hull, painted white with blue trim, and a distinctive wooden handrail around the stern. For weeks, the police focused their efforts on finding this vessel, operating on the theory that Ben and Olivia had gone aboard voluntarily, and something had happened subsequently, or that the skipper of this boat held the answers to their disappearance. However, despite an intensive hunt, no such boat matching that description was ever found. As the search dragged on with no trace of the missing pair, The investigation shifted from a missing persons inquiry to a homicide inquiry. The police began interviewing hundreds of people who had been in the Sounds that New Year's Eve. Amidst a myriad of tourists and boat eyes, one name began to surface repeatedly: Scott Watson. Scott Watson was a 31-year-old man from Picton, the gateway town to the Sounds. He was a carpenter by trade and the owner of a 26-foot single-masted sloop named Blade. He had been at Furneaux Lodge on New Year's Eve, celebrating on his own. Witnesses described him as a loner who had been drinking heavily that night. He was seen dancing with women, including Olivia Hope, and was generally observed to be in a boisterous mood. However, there was a glaring discrepancy. Watson's boat, the Blade, was a sloop, meaning it had only one mast. The witnesses, specifically the water taxi driver Guy Wallace and two female passengers who were dropped off just before Ben and Olivia, were adamant that the boat the couple boarded was a two-masted ketch. This detail became the central fulcrum of the entire case. Despite the difference in the boat description, the police began to focus their attention on Watson. He was interviewed several times, and his boat was searched. Initially, he cooperated with the police, allowing them to inspect the Blade. However, nothing suspicious was found in those early searches, and the police attention moved on. It was only weeks, if not months, later, after a tip-off from a prisoner and a re-evaluation of the timeline, that the police returned to Watson as their prime suspect. The theory shifted. The police began to believe that the witnesses were mistaken about the second mast, or that the lighting conditions at 3 a.m. had obscured the rigging of Watson's boat, leading them to believe it was a ketch. They postulated that Ben and Olivia had boarded the Blade. Watson had killed them, and then he disposed of their bodies and cleaned his boat to remove evidence. The evidence gathered against Scott Watson was circumstantial but extensive, leading to his arrest in September 1999, 8 months after the disappearances. The forensic investigation was the linchpin of the prosecution's case. When police searched the Blade in the months following the disappearances, they found evidence that the boat had been extensively cleaned. They recovered a blue blanket from the cabin that contained hairs consistent with Ben Smart. Perhaps more crucially, on the boat's carpet, they found fibers that were consistent with the clothing Olivia Hope was wearing that night. Furthermore, a fragment of a carpet that had been burned in a fire at Watson's parents' property was found to contain hairs matching both Ben and Olivia. The prosecution argued that Watson had killed the couple on board the Blade, cleaned the cabin to remove blood, cut the carpet out to dispose of it, and then burned it to destroy the evidence. Additionally, a witness came forward who claimed to have seen a man matching Watson's description on a boat in the remote Catherine Bay in the days following the disappearance, scrubbing the deck. The mystery ketch itself was never found, and the Crown argued that it either didn't exist or was a case of mistaken identity by the water taxi driver, who, they suggested, was influenced by police pressure to identify Watson. The prosecution painted a picture of Watson as a predatory loner who had been rejected by women at the party, including Olivia, and had lured the couple onto his boat in a fit of rage or opportunistic violence. The trial of Scott Watson began in Christchurch in September 2000, presided over by Justice Heron. It was a media sensation, captivating the public with its conflicting narratives and technical maritime details. The defense, led by Judith Ablett-Kerr, attacked the prosecution's case on the grounds of the boat identification. They argued vehemently that for the jury to find Watson guilty, they would have to accept that multiple independent witnesses were wrong about seeing a two-masted ketch. They brought in experts who testified that a sloop and a ketch look very different, especially to seasoned water taxi operators like Guy Wallace. The defense highlighted that the water taxi driver, Guy Wallace, initially identified Watson from a police photo montage as not being the man he had seen, and only later picked him out in a lineup after being pressured by police. Furthermore, the defense questioned forensic evidence, arguing that the transfer of hair and fibers could have occurred innocently while people were mingling on the various boats at the lodge before the couple disappeared. They suggested that the police had developed tunnel vision, ignoring other potential suspects and unexplained boats, including mysterious wooden launch seen in the area that was never identified. The defense painted Watson not as a murderer, but as a social misfit who had been on his boat alone that night, sleeping off a hangover, and was an easy scapegoat for a police force desperate to solve a high-profile crime. Despite the defense's robust arguments regarding the boat discrepancy, the jury ultimately sided with the Crown. After deliberating for approximately 10 hours, they found Scott Watson guilty of the 2 murders of Ben Smart and Olivia Hope. In December 2000, Justice Heron sentenced Watson to life imprisonment with a minimum non-parole period of 17 years. The verdict brought a measure of closure to the Smart and Hope families, who had endured nearly 2 years of agony, but ignited a firestorm of controversy in the wider New Zealand public. Many people, including high-profile commentators and authors, believed that Watson was innocent and that he had been wrongly convicted. The primary sticking point for the doubters was the mystery catch. How could a water taxi driver, whose job it was to identify boats, mistake a single-masted sloop for a double-masted ketch? The theory was that the real killer had fled on a different boat, and Watson, due to his drunken behavior and antisocial reputation, became a convenient suspect. Books such as The Mask of Sanity by Ian Wishart were published, arguing for Watson's innocence and suggesting police misconduct during the investigation. The case became a cause célèbre for those concerned about wrongful convictions. In the years following his conviction, Scott Watson has consistently maintained his innocence. He has exhausted almost every avenue of appeal. His appeals to the Court of Appeal were dismissed. In 2010, the then Governor General refused a petition for a royal prerogative of mercy, and in 2016, the Supreme Court declined to hear his case, effectively ending his legal options within New Zealand. His application to the Privy Council in London was also dismissed. Throughout his time in prison, Watson has been a model prisoner, according to reports, completing numerous courses and staying out of trouble. However, his stance on his guilt has been a major hurdle for his parole. The New Zealand Parole Board generally requires offenders to show remorse and admit to their crimes to be considered for release. Watson has steadfastly refused to admit to the murders, stating that he was in his bunk asleep at the time and that he did not kill Ben and Olivia. Consequently, his parole hearings have been denied, not only because of the severity of the crime, but because he is considered a high-risk offender due to his refusal to accept responsibility. This has led to a situation where Watson remains in prison, having served well over the minimum non-parole period, because his denial prevents the board from assessing his rehabilitation. The case continues to cast a long shadow. The families of Ben Smart and Olivia Hope have campaigned tirelessly to keep the focus on the victims and to support the conviction. They have spoken out against the conspiracy theories, emphasizing the forensic evidence and the jury's decision. For them, the speculation is a secondary victimization that prolongs their pain. On the other hand, the Justice for Scott Watson movement remains active, pointing to the lack of murder weapon, the lack of bodies, and the boat discrepancy as fatal flaws in the prosecution's case. The mystery catch, if it ever existed, has never been definitively identified or located, leaving a nagging question mark over the events of that night. The Marlborough Sounds, a place of beauty, hold the secret of where Ben and Olivia's final resting place is. Despite the massive search, their bodies have never been recovered. This absence of physical remains is the final, tragic element of the case, denying the families a proper burial and a place to grieve. Whether Scott Watson is a calculated killer who cleaned his boat to perfection, or an innocent man serving time for a crime he didn't commit, the saga of the disappearance of Ben Smart and Olivia Hope remains a dark chapter in New Zealand's true crime history, a case that challenges the certainty of the justice system and haunts all those who were touched by it. Number 7, Anthony Dickason. The case of Anthony Dickason is a harrowing chronicle of methamphetamine-induced psychosis and extreme violence that shocked New Zealand in the early 2000s, a period when the country was grappling with a devastating epidemic of the drug known as P, or pure methamphetamine. Anthony Dickason was a man with a history of mental instability and petty crime, but in the days leading up to January 2003, his behavior spiraled into a realm of profound delusion and lethal aggression. He was living a transient lifestyle, fueled by paranoia and heavy substance use, convinced that he was being hunted by police and rival gangs, and that he had a special, almost divine destiny. He was staying at a rural property in Te Hana, north of Auckland, with his girlfriend, Simone Butler, and a man named Renee Gunby. The atmosphere at the house was tense and thick with drug use, but the true horror erupted on the evening of January 21st, 2003. Dickason was in a state of severe mental breakdown, pacing the property armed with a samurai sword and a firearm, consumed by irrational fears. The catalyst of violence seemed to be a minor domestic dispute, perhaps over Dixon's drug use or his erratic behavior. But in his distorted mind, it became a battle for survival against a perceived threat. In a terrifying frenzy, Dixon turned the samurai sword on Simone Butler. He attacked her with a savagery that is difficult to comprehend, hacking at her body with a razor-sharp blade. Butler survived the brutal onslaught only by playing dead, but she suffered horrific injuries, including the severing of 3 fingers on one hand and severe lacerations to her head and body. Bleeding profusely and terrified for her life, she managed to flee the house, running through the dark paddocks of the rural property to escape her attacker, eventually making her way to a neighbor's home to raise the alarm. Her survival was nothing short of a miracle given the severity of the assault. However, Dixon's rampage was not over with the attack on his girlfriend. Still under the influence of his delusions and the chemicals flooding his system, he turned his attention to Renee Gumby, who was staying in a camper van parked on the same property. Driven by a mix of paranoia and rage, Dixon approached the camper van and attacked Renee Gumby with the same samurai sword. Unlike Simone Butler, Renee Gumby did not escape. Dixon beheaded him in a gruesome display of violence, an act that underscored the complete detachment from humanity he was experiencing. The killing was brutal and final, leaving another innocent victim dead in the quiet rural countryside. With his mind still fractured and believing he needed to eliminate witnesses or further threats, Dixon fled the scene in a vehicle, initiating a manhunt that would terrify the Northland region. For the next 2 days, Anthony Dixon was on the run, armed and dangerous. His whereabouts unknown to the public, but his image plastered across news bulletins as the police searched frantically for him. The fear in the community was palpable. A man capable of such indiscriminate, savage violence was loose, and no one knew where he would strike next. On January 23, 2003, Dixon resurfaced in the small town of Mongachiroto, further south. He broke into a property occupied by a woman, her partner James Teot, and their children. In this home invasion, Dixon's violence continued. He confronted James Teot and, without provocation, shot him in the face with a firearm at point-blank range. The bullet tore through James's face, but miraculously, he survived the catastrophic injury. The family was traumatized by the invasion, held captive in their own home by a man who appeared to be operating in a different reality. After the shooting, Dixon fled the property again, stealing the family's car and continuing his flight from justice. This second violent encounter within 48 hours confirmed that he was an ongoing and active threat to public safety. The police operation to capture him intensified dramatically, involving the Armed Defender Squad, the Eagle police helicopter, and a massive ground search. He was eventually located later that day, hiding in a gully near the Kaipara coast. The arrest was a tense confrontation. Dixon was cornered and reportedly threatened police before being overpowered. He was taken into custody, ending the spree of terror that had claimed one life and irreparably damaged 2 others. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and drawn out, largely due to Anthony Dixon's mental state. He was charged with the murder of Renee Gumby, the attempted murder of Simone Butler, the attempted murder of James Teot, and a litany of other weapons and kidnapping offenses. The question of his sanity was the central theme of the trial. Dixon's defense team argued that he was legally insane at the time of crimes, suffering from drug-induced psychosis, exacerbated by underlying paranoid schizophrenia. They presented evidence of his bizarre behavior in custody, his belief that he was a reincarnation of a samurai warrior or that he was being monitored by government agencies. The prosecution, however, argued that while Dixon was undoubtedly drug-affected and perhaps delusional, he knew exactly what he was doing was wrong, evidenced by his attempt to flee, cover his tracks, and his tactical decisions during the rampage. They painted a picture of a man whose violence was not a symptom of madness in a legal sense, but a result of years of volatile, drug-fueled aggression. The trial itself was fraught with difficulties. Dixon frequently disrupted proceedings, shouting at the judge, firing his lawyers, and at one point attempting to represent himself. His outbursts and unpredictable demeanor in the dock provided a visible demonstration of his disturbed mental state to the jury. In 2004, the jury found Anthony Dixon guilty of all charges, rejecting the defense of insanity. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum non-parole period of 22 years for the murder of Renee Gumby, and additional sentences for the attempted murders. The verdict was a controversial one among some mental health advocates who felt that the justice system had failed to recognize the depth of his psychiatric breakdown, but provided a sense of justice to the victims and their families who had suffered through his reign of terror. Anthony Dixon's time in prison was characterized by a continued decline in his mental health. He struggled to adjust to the prison environment and was frequently moved between facilities as his behavior became increasingly unstable. He was diagnosed with various mental health conditions during his incarceration, and there were ongoing concerns about his risk of self-harm and suicide. The tragedy of his life reached its final conclusion on February 11, 2009, when Anthony Dixon was found dead in his cell at Auckland Prison in Paramaribo. He had hanged himself, ending his own life just 5 years into his sentence. His death marked a sad and violent end to a tragic life, but for his victims, it did not erase the pain he had caused. Simone Butler, despite her horrific injuries and the trauma she endured, became an advocate for the victims of violent crime, courageously speaking out about her experience and the dangers of methamphetamine. She underwent numerous surgeries to reconstruct her hand and heal her scars, physically and metaphorically. James Teot also survived his injuries, carrying the physical and psychological reminders of the home invasion for the rest of his life. The case of Anthony Dixon remains one of the most stark examples of the nexus between severe drug addiction and violent psychosis in New Zealand. It highlighted the devastating impact of the P epidemic on individuals and families, a crisis that flooded the courts with similar, if less high-profile, cases of erratic, violent behavior. It also raised difficult questions about the capacity of the mental health system and the justice system to manage individuals who present a clear and present danger to society before tragedy strikes. The beheading of Renee Gunby and the attacks on Butler and Teot serve as a grim reminder of how quickly drug-fueled paranoia can escalate into lethal violence, leaving a trail of broken lives in its wake. Dixon's suicide in prison closed the book on a maniacal killer, but the scars left on that summer in 2003 remain a permanent part of the narrative of New Zealand's criminal history.